On March 14, 1859, the doors of Lecture Hall 3 at the Medical College of South Carolina slammed shut like a verdict. 17 physicians sat in rising rows of wooden seats, their black coats and stiff collars making them look like a jury instead of men of science. They had locked the room for one reason: to examine a case that should not exist. At the center of the amphitheater, under the cold gaze of anatomy charts and glass lamps, stood a 10-year-old boy. Black. Enslaved. Property. His name was Caleb. According to every book these men had ever trusted, someone like him could not do what they had come to see. Yet reports had spread through Charleston's medical circles like a slow, burning scandal. A slave child on a Beaufort County plantation who could perform mathematical calculations in his head faster than trained scholars could do with pen and paper. Problems that took professors half an hour, he could solve in seconds. No slate, no chalk, no schooling. That alone would have made him a curiosity. But in 1859 South Carolina, it made him something far more dangerous. If his abilities were real, they did not just challenge a theory. They threatened the entire story white society told itself about why slavery existed at all. Before we follow what happened in that locked hall and how 17 physicians failed a single child, you need to know where this story really begins. Far from Charleston, in the choking heat of the Sea Islands, on a plantation built out of cotton, cruelty, and lies, Beaufort County, South Carolina, lay stretched along the Atlantic coast, a jagged edge of marsh and water and wealth. The Sea Island cotton grown there was famous, silky, long staple, and worth a fortune. By 1859, the plantation owners of the region were some of the richest men in America. They were also some of the most determined to prove that their power was natural, justified, and permanent. Riverside, the Vance plantation, was one of the grandest of them all. Nearly 4,000 acres of land, over 200 enslaved people forced to work it. The main house was a white Greek Revival mansion with 16 Doric columns facing the Combahee River, like a temple to a god that demanded human suffering as tribute. From the bluff, you could see the flat green fields stretching out like a promise and a threat. The man who owned all of it was Colonel Edmund Vance, age 53. His colonel title came from his service in the Seminole Wars, not from any recent glory, but he wore it like armor. He moved through his world with the stiff certainty of someone who believed in a fixed order to all things. God above, white men beneath him, white women beneath them, and everyone black at the bottom, shackled to the soil. In the evenings, Vance sat in his library under oil lamps, surrounded by leather, bound books written by men who looked like him and thought like him. On his shelves were works by Dr. Samuel Cartwright and Josiah Knott, physicians who had devoted their science to proving that black people were biologically inferior, that their brains were weak, their intellects childlike, their bodies built for labor, not thought. Vance loved those books. He quoted them at dinner parties. He used them like scripture. They told him that the world made sense, that his power was not just cruelty dressed as law, but nature itself. He needed that belief like he needed air. Science, for him, wasn't a search for truth. It was a shield. Caleb was born somewhere on that vast plantation, sometime in late 1848 or early 1849. No one bothered to write down the exact day. Enslaved children appeared and disappeared in ledgers as numbers, not birthdays. His mother, Ruth, worked inside the big house as a seamstress. That job didn't spare her from suffering, but it did keep her out of the worst of the fields. She had been sold to Riverside when she was 15, taken from a smaller Georgia plantation after her previous owner died. Ruth's life had already taught her one hard rule. Anything you love can be taken. Anyone you rely on can be sold. Caleb's father was proof. He had been sold away before the boy's first birthday, shipped to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where most workers didn't live long enough to grow old. Ruth never spoke his name again. It was as if saying it aloud might crack her open. From the beginning, Caleb was not like the other children. Before he could speak clearly, he listened. At 3 years old, he began repeating whole conversations he'd overheard days earlier, word for word. He copied not just what people said, but how they said it. Their pauses, their sighs, the way a voice tightened on certain names. The house slaves noticed first. They whispered about the little boy with the strange memory, the child who never seemed to forget anything he'd seen or heard. Ruth noticed too, and her first instinct was not pride. It was fear. On a plantation, being ordinary might get you hurt. Being remarkable could get you destroyed. The strong ones were worked to death. The beautiful ones vanished into the master's bedroom and came back with broken eyes. The clever ones, the ones who read too quickly or spoke too well, were sold away to places no one ever saw again. So Ruth did what she could. She tried to smother her son's brilliance the way you might cup your hands around a candle in the wind. Not to keep it burning brighter, but to keep it from being seen. She taught him to keep his eyes on the floor, to answer questions softly, never eager, to act slower than he really was, to hide his sharp mind behind a dull mask, and for a while it worked. Caleb moved through Riverside like a shadow. He fetched water. He carried messages. He helped his mother with cloth and thread. To the white family, he was invisible, just another small dark figure in the background of their comfortable life. To the overseers, he was unremarkable and therefore ignorable. But some gifts refused to stay buried. The person who finally dragged Caleb's secret into the light was the one you might least expect, the master's youngest son. Marcus Vance was 14 in 1857, and the disappointment of the family. His older brother, Edmund Jr., met every expectation. He rode well, shot straight, spoke confidently, and seemed born for command. Marcus, on the other hand, was quiet, bookish, and clumsy on a horse. His father saw softness as weakness, and he did not hide his contempt. Marcus struggled most with mathematics. His tutor, a severe Charleston man named Mr. Coopersmith, had no patience for mistakes. Numbers, for Marcus, were not a language but a punishment. One sweltering August afternoon, Marcus sat in the courtyard near the main house, scratching furiously at a slate with chalk. Coopersmith had given him a problem involving compound interest, something with 7% on $4,000 over 9 years. The numbers swam. Marcus stared, tried, failed, and finally snapped. "Stupid numbers," he muttered, and hurled the slate toward the brick paving. It skidded to a stop near where a group of enslaved children were sweeping. Caleb was among them. He glanced down at the slate, took in the problem in a single heartbeat, and then looked away. Marcus stomped over, still fuming, and bent to grab the slate. Under his breath he said, "Who can calculate 7% compound interest on $4,000 over 9 years?" Without thinking, Caleb spoke. 5,830, 5 and 47 cents. "Sir." The broom fell silent. Every child froze. Marcus stared at Caleb, as if the boy had just started speaking in tongues. His face flickered from confusion to disbelief to something darker. He snatched up the slate and ran for the house, calling for his tutor. Caleb was left alone in the courtyard, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. Somewhere behind a window, Ruth watched, her stomach turning to ice. 20 minutes later, Marcus returned with Mr. Coopersmith, who looked amused and mildly annoyed at being dragged into the heat. "So this is the prodigy," the tutor said. "I assume he heard you working the problem earlier and merely repeated it." "I never solved it," Marcus insisted. "That's why I threw the slate." Coopersmith narrowed his eyes, then pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket. On the courtyard wall, he wrote, 347 tied to 83. He turned to Caleb. Well, Caleb could feel his mother's eyes burning into him from some unseen window. He knew he should shake his head, pretend he couldn't read the numbers, say he didn't understand. But numbers never looked complicated to him. They lined themselves up like soldiers, moved into formation, and settled into answers. He hesitated for half a second. Then the shapes slid into place. 98, 201, sir. Coopersmith worked through the multiplication on paper, his face tightening with every line. When he finally looked up, the color had drained from his cheeks. "Correct," he said quietly. He tested Caleb again, and again. Larger numbers, stranger combinations. The boy answered every time, quickly, calmly, as if someone were whispering the solutions into his ear. By evening, Colonel Vance himself stood in that same courtyard, arms folded, watching as his tutor tried, and failed, to find the limit of Caleb's gift. Problems from university texts, interest rates, yield calculations. The child, barefoot and thin, solved them all. Vance said very little. He just watched, his eyes cold and measuring. The way a man might look at a new piece of machinery he doesn't yet fully understand, but already knows could be extremely valuable. "How do you do this?" he finally asked. Caleb swallowed. "I see the numbers, sir," he said. "They arrange themselves when you say them, like a picture, but made of numbers. They move and connect until they fit." Vance waved him away. "That will be all." That night, in the cramped cabin behind the big house, Ruth held her son as if she could hide him inside her chest. For the first time in years, she cried openly. "You've been seen now," she whispered into his hair, "and being seen is the most dangerous thing that can happen to us." From that moment on, Caleb's life was no longer his. It had become a question, a problem, a crack in the story white men told themselves about what black minds could and could not do. And men like Colonel Vance, who needed the world to make sense in a very particular way, do not let cracks stay open for long. What happened next? The secret nighttime tests, the arguments in Charleston, the decision to drag a child into a locked medical lecture hall, would decide not just Caleb's fate, but how history chose to remember and then forget him. That is where the story truly begins. After that afternoon in the courtyard, Caleb stopped being invisible. For 3 weeks, Colonel Edmund Vance said nothing. He didn't mention the boy at dinner. He didn't speak of the calculations to his guests. He carried on as if nothing had changed. Reviewing account books, riding the fields, punishing the disobedient, praising the obedient. But at night, something had changed. One evening, just after sunset, a house slave appeared at Ruth's cabin door. "The colonel wants the boy in his study," he said. "Now." Ruth's hands tightened on the fabric she was mending. She had spent days praying this moment would never come, even as she knew it was inevitable. She smoothed Caleb's shirt, cupped his face in her hands, and looked him in the eyes. "You answer when spoken to," she whispered. "You don't ask questions. You don't show off. You don't smile like you're proud. You understand?" "Yes, Mama," he said, though pride had nothing to do with it. Numbers were not a trick to him. They were just there. The Conal's study smelled of pipe smoke, ink, and leather. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The heavy door closed behind them, with a sound that made Caleb's chest feel tight. At first, Ruth was allowed to stay, standing in a corner like a shadow while her son faced the man who owned him. Vance sat behind his desk, the lamplight casting sharp angles across his face. He started with simple questions. "Add these numbers. Multiply these. How many bales of cotton at this weight would fill a wagon of that size?" Caleb answered. Softly. Accurately. The next night, the questions grew harder. Problems from thick textbooks. Calculations involving interest over years and depreciation of farm equipment. Word problems about trade and shipping, about barrels and ships and miles of ocean. On the third night, Vance dismissed Ruth. "She can wait outside," he said. "The boy stays." Ruth opened her mouth, then closed it. A refusal could mean a beating, or worse. She met Caleb's eyes for one small second, the way a drowning person might grab another hand under the water. Then, she stepped out and listened to the door shut between them. From then on, the sessions took place in the dark belly of the house, just the colonel and the boy and a lamp burning low. Vance tested everything he could think of. He read out long strings of numbers and demanded Caleb repeat them backwards. He invented problems with no answer to see if the boy would break and guess. He tried to trick him with questions that sounded simple, but hid traps. Caleb kept solving. He didn't know where the answers came from, not really. When the colonel spoke, the numbers seemed to rise in his mind like shapes floating to the surface of water. Some were bright, some heavy, some sharp, edged. They moved around, joined together, and then settled into something that felt right. When he tried to explain that, Vance only frowned and wrote more notes. Because that was the other thing. The colonel had started writing. He kept a leather notebook open on the desk, recording Caleb's answers, the time it took him, the kind of problem used. He was turning the boy's mind into a series of lines on paper, something he could hold and study and try to force into his understanding of the world. But what disturbed Vance most wasn't just the answers. It was the way Caleb gave them. No joy, no fear, no pride, no visible emotion at all. It was as if the boy was emptying himself out each night, becoming a hollow pipe through which numbers flowed. Ruth saw the difference immediately. Each time Caleb returned to the cabin, he was a little quieter, his shoulders a little more hunched. When she asked, what did he want? The answer was always the same. Numbers, Mama. Just numbers. But his eyes said something else. They were older than his age, carrying a weight children weren't meant to carry. The quarters noticed, too. Around the water barrels and in the shadows of the kitchens, whispers spread. Some were proud. Proof that they were not what white men claimed. Proof that a boy with skin like theirs could think faster than any Charleston professor. Others were afraid. They had seen what happened when masters found a new way to use someone. An old woman named Temperance, who had seen more than most and survived more than many, cornered Ruth one morning near the smokehouse. "You need to make that boy stupid," Temperance said in a low, blunt voice. "Make him forget all them numbers before the colonel decides he's worth more as a curiosity than as a man." "I can't," Ruth whispered. "He don't know how to not know. It's just there in his head." "Then God help you both," Temperance said. "'Cause when they get too interested in one of us, it never ends clean." She was right. In January 1858, after months of testing and sleepless nights, Colonel Vance made a decision. The problem of Caleb could not be handled inside one plantation anymore. He needed outside confirmation. Not for the boy's sake, but for his own peace of mind. He sat at his desk and began to write a different kind of letter. These letters went to Charleston, to physicians, learned men with titles and reputations. The words were careful and vague. He invited them to Riverside to witness an unusual mental phenomenon in a youthful subject. He did not mention race. He did not mention slavery. He did not mention that the subject was a 10-year-old black child born in his fields. He knew exactly what he was doing. If he told them the truth too early, they would arrive with their minds already closed. He wanted them to see first, and only then feel the shock of it. One of the letters went to Dr. Nathaniel Crawford, professor at the Medical College of South Carolina and loud defender of a theory called polygenism. The belief that different races were different species altogether. Crawford had spent years insisting that the African brain was not just behind the European brain, but a different thing entirely. He liked skulls, measurements, and words that made cruelty sound like science. Another letter went to Dr. Thomas Aldrich, an older Charleston physician who had seen enough death and disease to lose his taste for certainty. He didn't speak much in public debates, but he watched carefully. A third went to Dr. Harrison Webb, younger, recently back from Europe, where he had read about strange minds, calculating prodigies, perfect memories, people who saw numbers as colors or shapes. Minds that didn't fit neatly into what anyone understood, but were real all the same. Some of these men saw an opportunity. Some smelled a challenge. Some simply expected a clever trick they could easily dismiss. The date was set February 7, 1858. The night before, Ruth lay awake, one arm under her son's head, listening to his slow breathing. In the main house, lamps burned late as Vance prepared. In the slave quarters, word passed from cabin to cabin, like a shiver doctors were coming. White men of learning, men who cut bodies open to look inside, men who wrote down what they believed and called it truth. "What if they take him?" Ruth whispered into the darkness, though no one was there to answer. She'd heard stories. Enslaved people with unusual talents sold to traveling shows, put on stages, made to perform, or taken north by men who called it study, and never sent them back. She thought of running, taking Caleb into the night, following the star stories she'd heard in broken whispers. About the drinking gourd, about North, about freedom. But she didn't know the land. She didn't know which white faces might help and which would betray. Caleb was small, and she was tired. The dogs were quick, the whips quicker. So she stayed, and prayed, and waited. In the morning, the doctors came. 6 men in dark coats stepped out of carriages onto the Riverside Drive. Their boots crushed the gravel, while enslaved people watched from a distance, pretending not to stare. Inside the drawing room, with its heavy curtains and polished wood, Colonel Vance greeted them like honored guests. He offered brandy, cigars, polite conversation about politics and weather. It was all theater. He needed these men to see him as their equal before he showed them what he had brought them here to see: a child who, by their own rules, should not exist. When he finally explained the purpose: a slave boy with extraordinary calculating powers, the reactions were immediate. Crawford looked amused and skeptical, as if he'd been invited to witness a magic trick for children. Aldrich leaned forward, quiet, curious. Webb listened without showing much on his face at all. Then Marcus brought Caleb in. The boy's shirt was clean. His hair was trimmed. He wore trousers a little too big and no shoes. His eyes were lowered. For a heartbeat, the room went very still. Some of the doctors had expected a grown man, or at least a teenager. Not a thin, bare-footed child who looked like he should be running in the yard. Not standing in a parlor full of men who held his life between their fingers. The examination began. It started simple: addition, subtraction, multiplication, the kind of tests any schoolboy might be given. Caleb answered, and every answer was checked with pencil and paper. The numbers matched. Then they made the problems larger, stranger, faster. 3-digit by 3-digit multiplication. Division that left ugly fractions, interest over years. They tested his memory with strings of digits. Again and again. Caleb's answers landed exactly where they should. "How do you do this?" Dr. Webb asked at one point, his voice not cruel, just genuinely searching. Caleb glanced at Vance, who gave the smallest nod. "I see the numbers, sir," he said. "They have colors, shapes. Big numbers are heavier. When you ask the question, they move in my head until they fit together right. Then the answer is just there. Silence. To assign color to numbers is nonsense," Dr. Crawford snapped. "This smacks of delusion, or rehearsed speech, or a perception we don't yet understand." Webb replied calmly, "There are documented cases in Europe of similar phenomena." Crawford dismissed this with a wave. "European indulgences. The boy repeats tricks. That is all." Then, Dr. Aldrich decided to remove any doubt of memorization. He checked his watch, looked at the window, and said, "It is now 2:47 in the afternoon. Tell me, how many seconds have passed since midnight?" Caleb's eyes went distant for a few seconds. 57, 4:20 seconds, sir." It took Aldrich nearly 3 minutes of careful counting and multiplication to confirm the answer. "Correct," he said softly. For 2 hours, they tested him. For 2 hours, he did not fail. By the time the doctors left, the air in the drawing room was thick with something no one wanted to name. Not wonder. Not admiration. Something closer to fear. Because if a black child born into slavery could do this with no schooling, no books, no training, what else had they been wrong about? Back in their cabin that night, Ruth held Caleb close. He trembled with exhaustion. "What happens now, Mama?" he asked. She didn't know, so she did the only thing she could. She rocked him, humming a song from a life she'd lost long ago, and prayed that whatever came next would spare him. But outside, on the verandas, and in the parlors of Charleston, his name, spoken without his consent, without his presence, had already begun to move from mouth to mouth, letter to letter, journal to journal. And once the story of Caleb reached the city's medical circles, he stopped being just a boy. He became an argument, a threat, and eventually, a problem that powerful men would rather bury than solve. News travels strangely in places built on hierarchy. It moves slow when it exposes power, fast when it protects it. Within days, the story of a slave child who could outperform Charleston's finest mathematicians seeped into the halls of the medical college, into doctors' lounges, into parlors where wealthy planters smoked and argued about politics. But the story did not travel whole. It traveled warped, stretched, sharpened into gossip. Some said the boy could recite entire textbooks after hearing a page once. Others said he predicted crop yields to the decimal. A few whispered that he was some kind of prodigy freak, a curiosity that nature made by accident. The truth, the quiet child solving numbers in a dim plantation study, was already getting buried under the weight of other people's versions of him. Dr. Nathaniel Crawford was the first to strike back, outraged that the public might take the Riverside demonstration seriously. He published a letter in the Charleston Medical Journal. He wrote it like a man defending a fortress, every sentence fortified to protect the theories he had built his career upon. He didn't deny the demonstration happened. Instead, he dismissed it. He claimed the test conditions were flawed, that the boy's mother or the plantation slaves must have coached him, that the problems had been memorized, rehearsed, repeated. He insisted that the African brain, scientifically proven to be inferior, simply could not do what Vance claimed. And if the evidence suggested otherwise, then it was the evidence, not the theory, that must be flawed. But Dr. Webb had been there. He knew what he saw. He knew the speed, the precision, the strange way the boy described numbers with colors and shapes. So he published a rebuttal. Calm, measured, but firm. He wrote that Crawford's explanations did not account for the spontaneous, unscripted problems the physicians had posed. He wrote that Caleb had solved equations without hesitation, that no time existed for memorization or tricks. He wrote that the boy's abilities were real, even if the mechanism remained unknown. His article wasn't emotional. It didn't attack. It simply pointed, again and again, to the facts. Dr. Thomas Aldrich added his voice too. He was an older, quieter man respected by many. His letter was short but devastating. He stated plainly that he himself had devised several of the problems on the spot, without telling another soul. No one, least of all a slave child, could have known them in advance. He asked why, if the demonstration were fraudulent, every physician present had failed to detect the fraud. His tone was not accusatory, but thoughtful, almost mournful, as if he feared the real truth lay not in what Caleb could do, but in what white men needed to deny. The debate spread wider than Charleston. A physician in Boston wrote requesting permission to examine Caleb himself. Northern newspapers caught wind and printed tiny columns suggesting that perhaps Southern science was hiding something inconvenient. Southern newspapers responded with fury, calling the entire thing abolitionist propaganda, meant to humiliate the South. Suddenly, a 10-year-old boy who had grown up invisible was now being used as a weapon in the most volatile political argument of the decade. It didn't matter that Caleb had never asked for attention. It didn't matter that he was still on a plantation, still doing chores, still sleeping on a thin blanket beside his mother. To the world beyond Riverside, he had become a symbol. To some, he was proof of hidden brilliance. To others, a dangerous exception that threatened the order of things. And to men like Crawford, he was a problem to be stamped out before it weakened their precious hierarchies. Letters began arriving at Riverside, some from scholars, some from wealthy Northerners who wanted to study the boy, some from circus operators offering money for a traveling exhibit of America's Negro Calculator. But the worst offers came from Southern planters, men who saw Caleb not as a mind, but as property whose price was rising. They offered enormous sums, enough to tempt any man with a ledger for a heart. Colonel Vance burned the Northern letters immediately. He refused the circus offers. He rejected the planters' money too, not because he cared for Caleb, but because he feared losing control of the narrative. South Carolina was already bracing for secession. Tension was thick as August heat. The last thing its elite needed was a slave child publicly undermining the scientific defenses of slavery. Vance understood that as long as Caleb stayed at Riverside, he could manage him. But once the boy entered the world's gaze, he would no longer be a curiosity. He would become a threat. So the colonel made a decision: no more demonstrations, no more visitors, no more letters answered. He closed the gates of Riverside and hoped the city would forget. But Charleston was a place that forgot what suited it and remembered what it feared. Doctors whispered. Planters speculated. Journal editors pressed the issue like a sore tooth. And the more people talked, the more dangerous Caleb's existence became. Inside the quarters, the slaves counted time differently. They didn't speak of politics or journals. They spoke of danger, of children sold because white men couldn't explain them, of bright minds dimmed for survival, of the way the world punished anything black that did not stay small. Ruth listened to these whispers with terror growing in her chest. Caleb was being talked about by strangers. Men she would never meet were debating her child's existence as if he were an animal, an experiment, a puzzle. She could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Something was coming, something big, dark, and unstoppable. And her son was standing directly in its path. Meanwhile, Marcus Vance watched all of this unfold with a troubled bitterness he didn't understand yet. He saw the letters arriving. He heard his father's tone when discussing Caleb. He noticed how the slaves whispered when the boy walked by. And something cold began to form in him. A mix of envy, confusion, and fear. His father had never praised him the way people described Caleb. His father had never written in notebooks about Marcus, never invited doctors to witness Marcus do anything. In the twisted logic of a boy raised to believe he was superior simply by being white, Caleb's ability felt like a threat, a crack in the story Marcus had been told since birth. And cracks, once they appear, only grow. The story of Caleb was no longer contained within the walls of Riverside. It was drifting into Charleston, into newspapers, into medical debates, into plantation gossip, into political fears. A quiet child who wanted nothing but safety had become a question Charleston did not want to answer. Because if Caleb was real, truly real, then everything they believed about race, power, intelligence, and the legitimacy of slavery itself would begin to rot from the inside. Charleston could argue. Doctors could deny. Planters could fear. But the truth had already been seen. A barefoot child had done the impossible. And no one, not even Colonel Vance, knew what to do with that. By the summer of 1858, Caleb's name had traveled farther than he ever would. His abilities were whispered about in Charleston porches, debated in medical halls, and quietly feared in plantation parlors. But while the city argued in print, and the colonel calculated his next move, the most immediate danger did not come from distant physicians or political currents. It came from inside Riverside itself, from a 14-year-old boy whose world had begun to crack in ways he couldn't understand. Marcus Vance had grown up believing that whiteness was a crown placed on his head at birth. His father never said it outright, but Marcus had absorbed it in every gesture, every expectation, every casual cruelty. He watched the adults around him perform without thought. He was told he was better, more capable, more intelligent by nature. And yet, here was Caleb, a child who slept on a dirt floor, who owned nothing, whose mother patched the clothes of others, doing things Marcus could not do even with a tutor and books and privilege. The contradiction gnawed at him. At first, he tried to hide his fascination behind curiosity. He approached Caleb with more math problems, desperate to find one the boy couldn't solve. But each correct answer chipped away at the foundation Marcus stood on. What did it mean if the boy he'd been raised to command could see numbers faster than he could even read them? Soon curiosity soared into something uglier. One afternoon in June, the heat pressing down on the land like a clenched fist, Marcus found Caleb sweeping in the stable. The air smelled of hay and sweat, and the shadows were long across the packed dirt floor. Marcus stepped inside, holding a chalkboard like a weapon. "Calculate this," he demanded, rattling off a problem thick with steps meant to trap anyone who wasn't trained. Caleb listened. The shapes clicked into place. He answered quietly. For a moment Marcus just stared. His face reddened, the disbelief turning sharp, violent. The books in his father's library said this was impossible. His tutor said this was impossible. His own sense of superiority said this was impossible. And yet the answer had come, calm and clean, from the mouth of an enslaved child. "You're cheating," Marcus snapped. "You must be." Caleb lowered his eyes. "No, sir." Marcus stepped closer, the chalkboard trembling slightly in his hand. "My father's books say you're kind. Can't think like this." His voice cracked on the words, not with emotion, but with fear of the world tilting under him. Caleb should have stayed silent. Ruth had taught him that silence was armor. But something in him, tiredness, frustration, or maybe the simple truth, rose up before he could stop it. "Then, maybe the books are wrong, sir." The slap came so fast Caleb didn't see Marcus move. His head snapped sideways, his body hit the dirt. The floor spun. His ear rang like a struck bell. Marcus leaned over him, breathing hard, eyes glittering with something vicious. "Don't you ever say that again. You're property. You exist because we allow you to. You think my father finds your tricks amusing? That makes you special. You're nothing?"
"Nothing,"
he stormed out, leaving Caleb on the floor with dust in his mouth and the iron taste of humiliation thick on his tongue. Caleb didn't tell Ruth. He didn't tell anyone. Some things were too dangerous to speak aloud. Besides, he already knew the truth. Marcus wasn't angry at him. Marcus was angry at what he represented. A contradiction. A flaw in the story white men told themselves to sleep at night. But the slap changed something inside Caleb. From that day forward, he walked the plantation with a new awareness. A sharp, cold understanding that his mind was not a gift but a threat. Marcus's rage wasn't a childish temper tantrum. It was a warning. To stand out was to invite violence. To be extraordinary was to risk being crushed. Meanwhile, Colonel Vance continued his sessions with growing intensity. Caleb could feel the colonel's anxiety, sharpening each evening as if Vance were searching for a crack in the boy's abilities he could use as explanation. The colonel's world depended on the belief that intellect followed skin color. Caleb's existence strained that belief to breaking. Even the other enslaved workers felt the tension. They watched the colonel summon Caleb night after night, watched the boy return drained and silent. Pride mixed with fear. Some whispered that Caleb's mind was a miracle. Others whispered that it was a curse. All understood that when white men became obsessed, black lives turned fragile. By late summer, when the days were long and fever-thick, the colonel made his decision. He would not let the matter fade quietly. He would not risk private shame. He needed the medical establishment, the pillars of Southern science, to validate what he had seen and make sense of it, or to deny it so thoroughly that he could continue believing his world was sound. He penned new letters, summoning a broader panel of respected physicians, men whose names carried authority across the South. This time the examination would not be a quiet demonstration at Riverside. It would be formal, public within elite circles, controlled to the last detail. It would be science staging a trial. The physicians accepted, not because they cared about Caleb, but because the controversy had grown too loud to ignore. They wanted resolution. They wanted to protect their theories. They wanted to defend the South's racial ideology at a moment when abolitionist pressure was rising like a tide. So they chose a date, March 14, 1859, and a place, the Medical College of South Carolina, where bodies were dissected, where theories were carved open, where inconvenient truths could be declared inconclusive and filed away. Ruth sensed the danger before anyone spoke it aloud. She watched the colonel's expression, watched the overseer's whisper, watched Marcus glare at Caleb, as if hoping he would disappear. She knew a storm when she smelled one. And this storm had her child's name on it. Each night she held him longer, as if trying to memorize the shape of him in case the world decided to take him. "Stay small," she whispered. "Stay safe. Don't let them see more than they want." But the trouble was this: the men who would soon examine Caleb didn't want to see him at all. They wanted to see their theories reflected back at them. And if Caleb didn't fit those theories, then they would make sure the world never heard him clearly. The boy who could see numbers like colors was heading toward a locked room where truth was less important than comfort, where science bent under the weight of fear, and where a child's mind would be put on trial by men who had already decided what the verdict should be. The weeks before the examination in Charleston were heavy with a strange, suffocating quiet. No one on the plantation spoke openly about what was coming. Not even the overseers, but everyone felt it. The way the air changes before a storm. The colonel grew tense and distracted, spending long hours in his study, writing letters and pacing the floor. Ruth watched from the doorway of the sewing room as he moved from shelf to shelf, pulling down books on anatomy, brain structure, racial science, and old mathematical texts he barely understood. He was searching for something, an explanation, a justification, a lifeline. And the more he searched, the tighter his jaw became. For Ruth, the dread was constant. It sat in her chest like a stone, growing heavier each day. She saw how the colonel studied Caleb at supper, when the boy delivered food. She saw Marcus glaring, not with curiosity now, but with cold resentment. She saw the way the other enslaved people avoided talking about Caleb when white ears were near. afraid even their whispers might carry. It was the feeling of living in a house full of dry timber, while someone walked around with a lit match. Then, on March 12th, the colonel announced that he, Marcus, and Caleb would leave for Charleston in the morning. No slaves were allowed to gather. No explanations were given. It was simply ordered, and therefore done. That night, Ruth held her son longer than she ever had. Caleb lay with his face tucked into her shoulder, listening to the sound of her heartbeat. He didn't cry. He had learned long ago that tears meant weakness. But his hands clutched the fabric of her dress, as if he feared it might disappear. She felt how small he still was, despite everything his mind could do. "Mama, will I come back?" She closed her eyes. The truth was too cruel to risk speaking. "You listen," she whispered. "Whatever they ask, answer slow. Answer gentle. Don't show them everything you can do. Don't let them think you're more than they want you to be." "But what do they want me to be?" he asked. Ruth swallowed. Something safe. But she knew the truth. Nothing about Caleb would ever be safe in their world. At dawn, the carriage wheels cracked against the frozen earth of the plantation road. Caleb sat beside Marcus, facing backward, watching Riverside shrink behind them. The fields where he had once played. The cabin where he slept beside his mother. The cotton rows that had swallowed the backs of so many before him. It all faded into distance like a place he had dreamed instead of lived. The journey took nearly a full day. Caleb didn't know Charleston, but he knew it was a place where slaves were bought and sold, where ships came and went, where laws were made and futures destroyed. When he first saw the tall houses with iron balconies, the cobblestone streets, the gas lamps flickering in the wind, it didn't feel like a city. It felt like a trap. The Charleston Hotel was grand, with shining floors and towering ceilings. But Caleb wasn't allowed to enter through the front. He was taken through the kitchen entrance and placed in a tiny side room with peeling paint and a rattling window. The enslaved hotel worker assigned to watch him was a man named Peter, broad-shouldered, tired-eyed, and careful in every movement. "They told me don't let you out my sight," Peter said, setting a plate of food in front of him. "What you do to get men of science all twisted up?" Caleb shook his head. "I didn't do nothing." Peter studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, as if he understood something unspoken. "That's how it goes. You breathe wrong, they say you causing trouble." The next day crawled by. Caleb wasn't allowed to go outside. He sat on the edge of the cot, swinging his feet, staring at the patterns the sunlight made on the floor. Every time footsteps passed the door, his stomach clenched. He tried to sleep, but every dream was the same. A door closing, a room full of eyes, a question he couldn't answer. On the afternoon of March 14th, the colonel arrived with the same stiffness he wore when delivering bad news. "It's time," he said, and that was all. They walked through Charleston streets, past carriages, past market stalls, past men in fine coats who did not glance twice at the black boy walking behind the colonel. Caleb had never seen so many people, so much noise, so much movement. Yet he felt utterly alone. The Medical College of South Carolina rose like a fortress, brick, stern, unsmiling. It was a place where bodies were cut open, where skulls were measured, where theories about inferiority were taught as universal truth. Caleb felt the weight of it pressing down, even before they stepped inside. The corridor smelled of chalk, alcohol, and something metallic beneath it. They stopped at a heavy wooden door, marked Lecture Hall 3. Marcus looked tense. The colonel looked determined, almost grim. Caleb just felt numb. Before opening the door, Colonel Vance did something he had never done before. He knelt so he was level with the boy. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but beneath that Caleb sensed something like fear. "Listen carefully," the colonel said. "Whatever happens in there, give them what they expect. Show what you can do, but don't show too much. Be impressive, but not frightening. Useful, but not dangerous. Understand?" Caleb nodded slowly. He felt like he was being told to walk on a rope stretched over a pit he could not see the bottom of. "Good," Vance said, standing. "Let's begin." He opened the door. The lecture hall was an amphitheater. Bright light poured onto the central demonstration table. Rows upon rows of physicians sat in rising tiers, their faces pale and expectant. 17 men, all watching him, all ready to decide what he was allowed to be. The door closed behind him with a heavy slam, the kind of sound a prison gate makes. Caleb felt it in his bones. Every head turned toward him. Every pair of eyes studied him, measured him, judged him. And in that moment, standing alone before men who believed they could read the truth of a person in the shape of his skull, Caleb understood he was not here to be seen. He was here to be dissected, without a knife, but just as thoroughly. The examination had not yet begun, but the verdict was already circling the room like a silent verdict. Explain yourself. Prove yourself. Or be dismissed as mistake, anomaly, or threat. The examination did not begin with violence, but with something colder. Certainty. The kind of certainty men carry when they believe the world belongs to them, and everything in it must fit neatly into the categories they created. Caleb stood alone at the center of the amphitheater, while Dr. Crawford descended the steps with the confidence of a man who had already decided the truth, and only needed to arrange the evidence to match it. The first questions were simple. Addition, subtraction, multiplication. The kind of problems Crawford imagined would reveal a trick or expose a memorized routine. Caleb answered quietly, each solution arriving in his mind like a soft light flickering on. He spoke slowly, not wanting to seem proud. He kept his eyes down, not wanting to seem defiant. Every number was correct, and with each correct answer the room grew tighter, the physicians leaning forward, pencils scratching faster. But these men were not here for simple arithmetic. They wanted to break him open. So the questions grew harder. 4-digit multiplication. Complex division. Word problems packed with details, meant to confuse even educated students. They asked him to convert measurements, compute interest, find amounts after depreciation. Some physicians timed his answers with pocket watches. Others whispered to each other, trying to detect hesitation or signs of guessing. There were none. Caleb didn't guess. He didn't calculate the way they did. The numbers simply formed themselves into patterns he could almost touch. Colors shifting, shapes locking together, solutions settling like dust after a storm. He did not know why his mind worked that way. He only knew it did. Dr. Webb watched with a strange softness in his eyes, as though witnessing a miracle he feared would be punished. Dr. Aldrich observed with quiet reverence, writing careful notes, but never interrupting. But Crawford's face darkened with every correct answer, his certainty sweating through his collar. After 2 hours, the break came. The doctors dispersed into small clusters, debating loudly around the rows of seats. Some insisted the boy's abilities were genuine. Others said they must be an elaborate trick. A few looked genuinely frightened, as if the child standing quietly by the table was not a boy at all, but a crack in the foundation of everything they believed. Caleb sat alone at the demonstration table, hands folded in his lap, back straight, eyes unfocused. No one offered him water. No one asked if he was tired. No one asked if he was afraid. He wasn't a child to them. He was a case. During the break, Dr. Webb approached him and knelt beside the chair so their voices wouldn't echo. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, almost whispering. Caleb blinked. The question didn't make sense at first. No one had asked him how he felt since he was very young, long before the numbers took over his life. "Tired, sir," he said. Webb nodded. "I believe that. You're doing something no child should be made to do under these conditions." He paused, lowering his voice further. "Caleb, listen to me. Some of these men came here hoping to prove you false. Others came here hoping to prove themselves right. None came hoping to understand you. That means you must protect yourself, even while answering." Caleb didn't fully understand, but he heard the warning behind the words. He nodded. "They will push harder now," Webb said. "Not because you've failed, but because you haven't." Before Caleb could reply, Crawford called the room back to order. His voice echoed with the authority of a man desperate to reclaim control. "We proceed," he announced. The second round was different. It was no longer about verifying ability. It was about destroying it. Crawford and the mathematician from South Carolina College, Dr. Henderson, brought out advanced textbooks. They posed problems no 10-year-old could possibly understand. Algebraic equations, geometric proofs, word problems layered like traps. Henderson wrote a quadratic equation on the slate. Solve for x. Caleb stared at the symbols. He didn't know algebra. He didn't know formulas. But the equation balanced itself in his mind. The symbols weren't symbols. They were weights, shapes, forces pulling against each other, until he saw the points where everything settled into harmony. He gave both answers. The room inhaled sharply. Henderson recalculated them on paper. When he finally looked up, his face had drained of color. "The boy is correct," he said. Crawford snapped like a bone under pressure. "Impossible! He has never been taught algebra. His race is incapable of abstract reasoning. He must have memorized." Henderson cut him off. "Memorized what? This problem has never been seen by anyone in this room. Until this moment." Crawford turned on Caleb, eyes burning with something venomous. "Explain your method." Caleb swallowed. His heart hammered. He thought of Ruth's words. Don't show them everything. But he couldn't lie. Not here. Not with so many eyes on him. "The numbers, they move," he whispered. "They show me where they balance." Crawford slammed his palm onto the table. "Nonsense! Numbers do not move. They do not balance. You repeat words someone taught you to mimic understanding." "It is not mimicking," Webb said quietly. "It is perception." "Perception?" Crawford barked. "This is a parlor trick dressed in Negro superstition." The room erupted into argument. The physicians weren't debating Caleb anymore. They were debating themselves, their beliefs, their pride, their fear. But Crawford wasn't done. He descended the steps again, this time with a sheet of paper he had been writing on moments before. "One final test," he said through gritted teeth. one that cannot be guessed or intuited. He read a problem involving 3 workers building a wall. Rates, fractions, time, combined effort. It was long, winding, constructed specifically to confuse. Caleb closed his eyes. The numbers rose in his mind, not as chaos but as pieces aligning in a clear, inevitable sequence. He opened his eyes. 2 hours and 9 minutes, he said softly. Or 2 hours, 8 minutes, 34 seconds if you want it exact. Crawford worked the problem on paper, furious, scribbling, recalculating. With every passing minute, the tension in the room thickened like smoke. When he finally lifted his head, his voice was flat. The answer is correct. No applause, no admiration, only silence. Heavy, suffocating, dangerous. Because in that moment, every man in the room realized something terrifying. Caleb didn't just challenge their theories. He threatened their authority, their world, their science, their justification for slavery itself. And men who feel their world shaking do not react with humility. They react with violence, if not of the fist, then of the pen, the verdict, the silence. The colonel stood. His chair scraped the floor like a blade. Gentlemen, we have tested the boy to exhaustion. You have your evidence. Let us end this. But the physicians did not leave united. They left fractured, angry, afraid, determined to rewrite what they'd seen into something they could live with. Caleb stood alone as the room emptied, feeling the weight of their fear settle over him like chains. He had passed every test, and somehow that made him less safe than ever. And men who feel their world shaking do not react with humility. They react with violence, if not of the fist, then of the pen, the verdict, the silence. The colonel stood. His chair scraped the floor like a blade. Gentlemen, we have tested the boy to exhaustion. You have your evidence. Let us end this. But the physicians did not leave united. They left fractured, angry, afraid, determined to rewrite what they'd seen into something they could live with. Caleb stood alone as the room emptied, feeling the weight of their fear settle over him like chains. He had passed every test, and somehow, that made him less safe than ever. The controversy should have changed everything. 17 educated men had witnessed a truth that contradicted their own doctrines. But truth is powerless when the people who hold power refuse to accept it. After the Charleston examination, no great announcement was made. No new theory was proposed. No admission of error entered the medical journals. Instead, a quiet, deliberate hush settled over the entire affair, like dust covering something inconvenient. Within a month, Dr. Crawford published another article. This one written with the bitterness of a man defending a collapsing wall. He insisted that Caleb's abilities were exaggerated, misinterpreted, or the result of flawed methodology. He accused Northern influences of corrupting Southern science. He accused fellow physicians of being too eager to embrace anomalies that threatened the natural hierarchy of man. His words were heavy, with fear disguised as authority. Dr. Webb attempted to respond again, but the tone of Charleston had already shifted. The political air was sharpened by anger, secession talk, and looming war. Acknowledging Caleb now didn't just challenge racial science. It risked giving ammunition to abolitionists in the North. And so Webb's voice grew quieter, pushed to the margins by louder, angrier men defending a system built on denial. Meanwhile, back at Riverside, Colonel Vance made his own decision, one not written in journals, but carved into the life of a single child. On a warm May morning, He called Caleb into his study. There were no books on the desk this time. No numbers. No tests. Just the colonel, straight-backed and rigid, looking at the boy, not as a curiosity or anomaly, but as a threat whose consequences he could no longer control. "The physicians have not agreed on your case," he said slowly. "And given the circumstances facing this state, this nation, such disagreements are undesirable." He tightened his jaw. "You will go into the fields." Caleb blinked. For a moment he didn't understand. His world had been numbers, not cotton. He had never picked a full day in his life. The colonel continued, "You will work quietly. You will not display your skills. You will tell no one what happened in Charleston. If you wish to survive what is coming, you will be ordinary. You will disappear." The words landed like blows. Ruth begged to see him, to understand, to plead. But all she received was permission to see her son only on Sundays. The rest of the week, he belonged to the fields. The colonel framed it as protection. It was, in reality, erasure. And so Caleb walked into the rows of cotton, into the blinding sun, into the world he had been born for and yet did not fit. His fingers bled. His back ached. His mind dulled itself into survival mode. But numbers still haunted him. Even as he stooped in the dirt, numbers floated before his eyes. Patterns, sequences, hidden harmonies in the mundane repetitions of labor. He tried to push them away, tried to be what the colonel wanted unremarkable. In the quarters, people watched him with sympathy or suspicion. Some whispered that the colonel was hiding him because he was dangerous. Others whispered that he was cursed. A few saw him as a sign that something in their world, long believed unchangeable, was not as fixed as the masters insisted. The war crept closer. In November 1862, Union forces swept through the Sea Islands. Plantation owners fled inland in chaos, abandoning their homes, their cotton, their books, and the people they claimed to own. For Ruth and Caleb, the moment was both liberation and terror. Freedom arrived like a door blown open by a storm, sudden, loud, and disorienting. The Port Royal experiment brought northern teachers and officials to the region, trying to build lives for people who had never been allowed to own themselves. One such teacher, Elizabeth Babcock, recorded meeting a boy with remarkable talent in calculation. She planned to bring him into one of the new schools, but the next day, Caleb and Ruth vanished. Some said Ruth feared he would be taken north by curious abolitionists. Others believed she feared Southern retaliation should the Confederates retake the land. Or perhaps she feared the same thing she had feared his entire life, that being remarkable would kill him. Where they went, no one knows. By 1867, a Charleston newspaper mentioned a colored youth performing arithmetic tricks at the docks for coins. The journalist dismissed him as a liar, yet the description, thin, quiet, precise, echoed like a ghost of Riverside. If it was Caleb, no one recorded his name. If it wasn't, then another boy had learned the danger of trying to be known. The scholars who once argued about him simply moved on. Their silence, like the cotton fields he once walked, swallowed him whole. History does not lose people like Caleb by accident. It loses them on purpose. Because to remember him is to remember the truth that frightened them all. That brilliance does not come from bloodlines, or skin, or privilege, but from the ungoverned mystery of human mind. Years later, long after the war had ended and the plantations of South Carolina had rotted into myth, fragments of the story resurfaced. Old papers, misfiled journals, a line in a medical ledger, a forgotten letter in a descendant's attic. None told the full story, but each carried a faint echo of the child they had tried so hard to forget. Dr. Webb, older and quieter, returned to Charleston after the war. When asked in 1875 about the boy once examined in Hall 3, he said something that clung to memory. We witnessed a truth we were not ready to accept, and rather than change ourselves, we changed the story. Dr. Crawford died never admitting he might have been wrong. He wrote in his final paper that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, a phrase meant not to open minds, but to protect them from change. And Dr. Aldrich, whose journals were discovered decades later, carried a private shame. He wrote that he had watched men cling to prejudice over evidence, comfort over truth. He wrote that they had chosen cowardice and called it science, and that he had failed to speak loudly enough when it mattered. But nowhere did the records tell what happened to Caleb. His mind, his fear, his childhood, his astonishing ability, all dissolved into silence. A silence so complete it could only have been deliberate. Because Caleb represented everything Southern science feared, that intelligence was not confined to race, that brilliance could bloom in the most oppressed soil, that a child born into chains could outthink men who had built their identities on superiority. And so they buried him, not with dirt, but with silence. Not in a grave, but in forgotten archives. But truth has a way of surviving in fragments, and those fragments lead us to one unshakable conclusion: Caleb lived. Caleb thought. Caleb broke their rules. And the only reason his name isn't in textbooks is because the men who wrote those textbooks were terrified of what he proved. If he survived the war, he may have lived quietly somewhere, hiding his gift to stay alive. If he didn't survive, then he joined the countless unnamed children whose brilliance was extinguished by a world built to deny it. But here is the part no one could erase. For 4 hours on March 14, 1859, in a locked room full of men who believed they understood the human mind, a black child solved problems faster than educated adults could comprehend. He revealed a truth that science should have welcomed, but instead buried. He forced powerful men to stare at a possibility that threatened everything they valued. They chose silence. They chose comfort. They chose their world over the truth. And yet, Caleb's story survived long enough to reach you. Long enough to be told again. Long enough to remind us that the greatest danger to truth has never been ignorance, but the fear of what truth will force us to see. If you're reading this now, then Caleb is no longer lost. You have remembered him, and memory is a kind of justice.